Thank you, Maria. I think we're going to hone in on three of the listed compliance requirements. So the first one is accessible policies. So we really want, I mean, the number of agencies that have over 50 employees is probably low. Clearly, like some of the multi-service agencies would, and they probably have an HR department that is engaged in AODA compliance work already, as we do as Daily Bread. But so kind of focusing on the under 20, and as Maria said, part-time, seasonal contract workers, and full-time workers, but not volunteers and not independent contractors. Accessible policies should be created for under 20 employees. They don't have to be documented though, unless you're 50 plus, but they should be in place. And so you should be compliant with a lot of these things. And I think it's probably a good idea to document them because you can introduce part of the training is training employees on new employees and volunteers for you, staff and volunteers on your policies. So why not document them and have them there for everyone and transparency's sake as well. Um, they encourage policies to be guided by these four principles: dignity, independence, integration, and equal opportunity. And I like the kind of definition that they're holding there. So making sure that people with disabilities, again, this is just a guide to when you're creating your policies, to think about these four tenets. So people with disabilities are able to maintain their own respect and the respect of other people. They can do things without necessary help from other people or interference. So, if there's, as Maria said, if there's a sign that just tells you where to go, that would be great. And and you don't have to ask somebody necessarily, or no one has to guide you there. And of course, if they have to, that is maybe it's very complicated, and that's fine too. And that's something you offer, and upon request, you can do that. But having this idea of people being independent, and as far as you can allow that or accommodate that, that would be best. um, Integration. So allowing the person with disabilities to benefit from the same service. Yeah, doesn't it maybe doesn't have to be another route or another room or another way. If you can sort of make it equal, then people can access in the same way, and that maybe looks like the lowest, what we would call like the kind of the lowest common denominator. So making things like shopping, for example, people can go around and look at labels on their food, and everyone can benefit from a shopping model. Everyone kind of wants to choose their food if that's possible, for lots of reasons. But if you have a nut allergy or a specific diet, you are choosing labels is going to be more important to you, or a medical condition. So yeah, something that allows everybody to access in the same way is nice and doesn't, again, exclude people or someone has to kind of ask for their own accommodation. And equal opportunity, which we know is probably happening in a lot of food banks, but people can access equally. So again, if they're given a bag, if they have to have a bag outside, it can be food of their choice, not necessarily like a pre-packed hamper, or they're able to access fresh food still. You have someone that can go get it for them. And the recommendation here is to make a list of all the things that you do to provide good customer service and identify and remove and prevent the barriers. So think about if it follows these four, if it allows the independence. So if you already have accommodations, do they follow this guide? And that's just for the policies, but then of course your policies will guide your actions. So the second thing was training. So you will be required to train your volunteers and staff. So this is a bigger one for folks. I think we see that people have a lot daily bread. We have tons of thousands of volunteers, and so you might have to have some kind of training program or orientation for your volunteers that includes standardized trainings on, for example, here you have to train folks on the Human Rights Code. We can send this out or I can add it to the chat. There are free training modules that you can find on the Human Rights Code, and Daily Bread will be offering trainings as well, so you can sign up for those. Um, yeah, so that's one of the trainings that you have to offer. You also have to offer training on your accessible customer service, so things that you do. And I've included here one of the recommendations that they include is to train your volunteers on what to do if a person with disability is having trouble accessing your goods and services. So for me, that immediately indicated like someone with a mental health issue, for example, is like not able is having is showing something that maybe people perceive as scary or dangerous or something. Um, we often see that as like an escalation, and people treat that person as if they are escalated and dangerous or potentially going to be dangerous. Sometimes people call the police on them if they suspect something, um, or they say something that indicates to them that they're dangerous. Um, this is a fine line, right? Like they have a disability, and in this fictitious case, they have a disability of a registered mental health issue, and so, as a food bank, as a kind of last resort, we do have the obligation to serve them. And so, you're really balancing. You're doing as much. Your responsibility is to do as much as you can to accommodate this person and make sure that they have food. And maybe that is serving them outside, or having some kind of maybe there is a restriction, a program restriction is warranted for their actions or their words, but making sure that they actually do leave with food, they have access to your goods is important. So then that is part of the requirement. Other kinds of training that you'll be asked to offer, uh, what the AODA is, and again, you can access these trainings through their website, through the Ontario.ca page, and we can put that in the chat as well. An overview of your customer service policy or protocols, your policies that you may have documented, how to interact with people with various disabilities. And sometimes you think that's intuitive, but actually it's not. Like people might not have had people in their life with vision loss or something like that. So really just going over learning disabilities, mental health disabilities, going over the different kinds, invisible versus visible, and what your response should be. And those should be trainings that you do with your volunteers. How to interact with people who are using assistive devices or mobile devices or equipment. And also how to interact with people using service animals or a support person. So again, someone might come in with their brother, and their brother is giving their intake information, training your volunteers that that's okay, and or if people have a service animal, we'll talk a little bit about that on the next page. But do not pet the service animal, things like that. Don't they're not a pet. They're a worker, and treating them as such. So things like that. It probably will not be it doesn't have to be an extensive training, but making sure that people are trained, all your volunteers are trained. Um, and if you have any, as Maria said, screen readers, or if you do have a kiosk, we have one at New Toronto Street where people can register themselves, or maybe you have an iPad or something where people can use the self-registration portal. If you have a screen reader on that, making sure that's accessible as well, and then training your volunteers on how to use that. So if people come in needing that accommodation, they can readily have it from your volunteers. Um, and then, as I said, highlighted this one, which I think is kind of a bigger one, making sure that if someone is having trouble accessing, that your volunteers are trained on how to make sure that they get what they need. And any accessibility requiremements that apply to their specific job. So intake, for example, you're having a conversation with someone. If they're nonverbal, how are you going to do intake? So having a plan for that, and then training that person on what to do. And specifically, if you do provide training and education, as we do at Daily Bread, you will need to train volunteers on accessible course delivery as well. So yeah, and as Maria said, for the website, that already exists. There's a standard for like accessible website content and accessible course delivery that you can find online. And lastly, and this is probably the bigger one, providing accessible customer service. So some points here, and again, this is actually from the Ontario page, which is great that they've outlined a lot of the customer service, some tips, I guess, and kind of rethinking offering great customer service to everybody, and they offer this for businesses, nonprofits, public, private, and government as well. So these are kind of universal, and you would expect them from any place that you would go, and we would also expect you to offer that at your program. So um, starting from the top, communicating in a manner that takes into account the person's disability. So, as Maria said, providing accessible formats for information in different ways, providing if people need to write something down, or the way that you're interacting with the person. If they have vision loss, you're not showing them a sign or pointing to the sign and telling them they need to read the sign. You're reading it out loud, or reading a document out loud. So, making sure that you can interact with the person in the way that they need to be interacted. um, Allowing assistive devices. So most people do, but you do have to allow assistive devices in your space. You have to make sure there's space for people to have wheelchairs and scooters. Maybe in your waiting area, there should be space there. You have the chairs really close together. You have to have like a space that's slightly bigger. And of course, if you have accessible washrooms, which I think a lot of people did in our survey, which is amazing, that people have a washroom and it's accessible. It's fantastic. But if you don't, thinking about that, and yeah, maybe if there is an accessible washroom on site, making sure that people can access. Maybe it's at the back of the building that people don't usually have access to, making sure that people can be accommodated. Um, I also love that they sort of mention other equipment, like thinking about an oxygen tank. That's not necessarily something I think about. Having an open flame near an oxygen tank is like a big no. Thinking about what other kinds of assistive devices other than wheelchairs and scooters that people are going to have, and making sure that you can accommodate those as well, and integrating any helpful measures you can. This is a big one for our programs. Having volunteers that can help carry things through their car or out to people. If you have a big flight of stairs, and maybe someone can go up and down the stairs, but not holding their heavy items. Um, any kinds of accommodations that you can make, and usually just having a little bit more people power will help with that. Um, Service animals, as I mentioned, avoid touching them, or yeah, addressing the service animal necessarily. They're working. Um, a couple of notes on the service animals. I think this can be kind of a tricky one if you have a meal program or a kitchen, or people are not necessarily wanting animals and food to mix. Um, it is maybe you can clearly identify which areas of the premises are open to service animals. That's okay. If you need to have a private moment with someone and they have a service animal, and your only private space is a kitchen, you might have to find a different private space. So maybe you have to go upstairs or something. So thinking about that ahead of time, um, and noting that service animals can come in different forms. I think we're used to dogs, but people can have birds and other kinds of animals. Um, and also specifically, there a lot of different kinds of disabilities require service animals. You might not be able to see the disability that the person has. Maybe they have anxiety and they have their service animal there. And so just don't make assumptions about people. We're not asking too many intrusive questions. I think there is a requirement for them to provide documentation for the service animal, but ideally, if you're able to let that go, we know that documentation is hard for some folks in our network. So really, if you can allow it, please do. But of course, you have to allow it, but without the documentation as well. I thought this one was also particularly relevant for the network, providing notice of temporary disruptions. You might close your program for a week. Maybe it's a planned closure, or maybe it's a surprise. Making sure that you give a lot of notice. We recommend 6 weeks of notice for like a systems change, at least a month's notice if you can for a closure. Or if it's a surprise closure, 2 weeks if you can, or whatever you can do. Plus, making sure that there's referral information posted. Also, post signs have information available in different ways. Tell people if there's businesses or neighbors around that people can ask questions to. That would be great. A phone number there if people can call for more information. Change your voicemail so that when people call, this is a big one. When people call your number that's listed on 211, they can have that information up front. So people are not coming all the way there just to see the sign posted. Have that information available in as many different places as possible. And lastly, creating ways that people can provide feedback to your program that is accessible. So, written comment cards, person that they can talk to that will maintain some confidentiality, and maybe the way that you provide address that feedback can be in written form that you post back on a community board, or have a person that you wears a T-shirt that says "Ask me anything" or something like that. Have that a greeter position or something that knows the answer to that question or has received that feedback, and this is when we're going to change that system. This is when it's coming, or we're going to change our hours. This person's well informed, so they can answer questions as well. Um, Particularly around complaints. So if you have a feedback process, that's great. But particularly around complaints, make sure that there are ways that people can, so they can do it in person, over the telephone, in writing, as we said, or another way. But clarify how a process that's transparent. Clarify how people will can make their complaint, how it will be addressed, when it will be addressed, what's your turnaround time. Like, we have a very clear policy that Maria Solis is as part of her role to address complaints from the network, but we have a 48-hour turnaround time on all complaints. So it's, they're taken seriously, and we want to make sure to connect with people quickly. So have that transparent, and people will know, the process. That makes people feel at ease. And also, if there is some accommodation that's needed or a way that you need to be changing the way that you work, you'll very quickly know that. Maria, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think also how we make accommodations for clients. So some of our programs have a separate line for people with disabilities, and then these programs who have those lines sometimes have a process for vetting people who say they have a disability. So I know of one program that asks for a letter from a doctor. Um, and so we have to be careful, I think, how we manage this, because similar to the idea of who is worthy of attending a food bank and who should and should not attend. It's the same with this. Is you shouldn't have to prove. Saying it is enough. Saying I have a disability and I need an accommodation is enough. So trying to be as open with people and not making them feel like it's an additional barrier to prove that you have a disability to receive this accommodation, I think is important for people to consider when making these changes in their program.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, that's great. We've some of the complaints that we've received in past are from clients who tried to access, during the first half an hour when people do say like seniors and folks with disabilities, but sometimes they mean physical disabilities only. Say that, so visible disabilities only. Maybe now there's the right language to use. And then there's a very public interrogation of a person and their body, about if they are disabled enough or whatever, however this conversation plays out, and people are revealing like confidential information about their disability, their bodies. Like, it's entirely inappropriate, and I think sometimes that's just an honest mistake. We're thinking about certain kinds of disabilities and thinking, oh well, if you you use a scooter or your walker, we don't want you to wait in this line. But what about people who have a lot of anxiety and who can't be around large crowds, things like that. Thinking about, as a program, thinking about what that means for that person and how we can accommodate them, and maybe they don't go at the same time as others, but maybe another accommodation is given to them. And can you put that out there? If you need something, please talk to us. Reach out to this person, or this is the coordinator, please talk to them, and making that more of a transparent process that people can come ask you for things, or come talk to you with confidentiality.